The dim glow of the neon signs flickered against the rain-slicked pavement as Jinwoo stepped into the abandoned arcade, the scent of damp wood and rusted metal thick in the air. The city beyond these hollowed-out walls buzzed with life, but here, in this forgotten corner, silence reigned. His fingers traced the edge of a dusty chessboard, its pieces arranged in perfect symmetry, waiting for a game that would never come. At least, not one anyone else could see. Jinwoo exhaled, his breath misting in the cold, and sat across from the empty chair. His opponent was invisible, not just to the eye, but to the world. Yet he could feel its presence, a weight pressing against his ribs, a whisper in the back of his skull. The first move was always the hardest. He nudged a pawn forward with practiced ease, the click of the piece against the board unnaturally loud in the stillness. A second passed. Then, with a shuddering breath of unseen wind, the black knight slid forward on its own. Jinwoo's lips curled into a grim smile. This was his ritual, his secret battle. The world outside knew him as Sung Jinwoo, the weakest E-rank hunter in Seoul, a man barely capable of surviving the dungeons that had swallowed so many stronger than him. But here, in the shadows, he was something else entirely, a strategist, a survivor, a man who refused to break even when the odds were stacked against him. Across the board, the invisible enemy made its next move, the pieces shifting with eerie precision. Jinwoo countered, his mind racing ahead, 3 moves, 5, 10. The game was more than just chess, it was a test, a reflection of the battles he fought every day. The dungeons were no different. Monsters lurked behind every corner, their movements as calculated as the pieces on this board. But unlike the hunters who relied on brute strength, Jinwoo had learned to think. A sudden gust of wind sent the chessboard trembling. The pieces rattled, then stilled, except for the Black Queen. It toppled, rolling toward the edge before Jinwoo caught it. His fingers tightened around the cold marble. Something was wrong. The air thickened, the shadows stretching unnaturally long across the floor. The arcade's broken screens flickered to life, static hissing like a chorus of whispers. Jinwoo's pulse spiked, his instincts screaming. This wasn't part of the game. Then, movement. A silhouette emerged from the darkness behind the empty chair, a figure wreathed in shifting mist. No, not a figure. A shape, something that defied definition, its edges blurring like ink in water. The temperature plummeted. Jinwoo's breath came in sharp bursts, his body coiled tight. The thing leaned forward, and the chessboard screamed. Wood splintered. The pieces exploded upward, suspended in midair for a heartbeat before hurtling toward Jinwoo like shrapnel. He twisted, his body moving on pure reflex. A pawn grazed his cheek, drawing blood. The knight whistled past his ear, embedding itself in the wall behind him with a sickening thunk. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. He lunged, his hand closing around the fallen Black Queen. The moment his fingers made contact, the world shifted. A surge of energy tore through him, violent and electric. His vision blurred, then sharpened, colors brighter, shadows deeper. The arcade melted away, replaced by an endless void, a chessboard stretching into infinity. And standing across from him, the enemy. No longer invisible. It was a knight clad in obsidian armor, its hollow visor fixed on him. In one gauntleted hand, it held a sword darker than the void itself. Jinwoo's grip on the queen tightened. He didn't know how he'd gotten here, didn't know what this thing was, but he knew one thing. This was no longer a game. The knight charged. Jinwoo barely had time to raise the queen like a shield before the blade came crashing down. The impact sent him skidding backward, his boots scraping against the unseen board. Pain flared up his arm, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward, swinging the queen like a dagger. The knight parried, metal shrieking against marble. They clashed again and again, a deadly dance of strikes and counters. Jinwoo's muscles burned, his breath ragged, but his mind was clear. He saw the pattern, the knight favored its right side, its movements just a fraction slower when pivoting left. A weakness. He feinted right, then twisted left, driving the queen upward in a brutal arc. It connected with the knight's helm, sending cracked spider webbing across the dark metal. The knight staggered. Jinwoo didn't let up. He pressed the attack, each strike precise, calculated. Then, the knight changed. Its armor split apart, tendrils of shadow erupting from the cracks, writhing like living things. The sword dissolved, reforming into something monstrous, a jagged spear of pure darkness. Jinwoo barely dodged the first thrust, the weapon tearing through the space where his heart had been a second before. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a knight. It was evolving. Just like the dungeons. Just like him. The realization hit like a hammer blow. The dungeons weren't random. The monsters weren't mindless. They adapted. They learned. And if this thing was connected to them, if it was testing him, pushing him, then this fight was only the beginning. The knight lunged again. Jinwoo met it head on. The queen in his hand glowed. A surge of power, raw and untamed, erupted from the marble piece. Light seared through the void, illuminating the infinite board, the watching shadows. The knight recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jinwoo didn't question it. He struck. The queen shattered against the knight's chest, and the world exploded. Jinwoo gasped, stumbling back into the arcade, the chessboard whole once more, the pieces neatly arranged as if nothing had happened. But his hand still tingled with residual energy. And his reflection in the broken arcade screens. For a split second, his shadow moved on its own. Then the moment passed. Jinwoo exhaled shakily, wiping the blood from his cheek. The invisible enemy was gone, for now. But the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The chessboard shimmered under the dim glow of Jinwoo's lantern, its pieces arranged in an eerily familiar formation. His fingers hovered over a pawn, the weight of his last move still pressing on his mind. The air was thick with tension, not just from the game but from the unseen presence he'd been battling since part 1. Every move he made was met with an invisible counter, the pieces shifting on their own as if guided by an unseen hand. But tonight, something was different. The board trembled, and a cold whisper slithered through the room, "Check." Jinwoo's grip tightened around the lantern. He wasn't just playing against an invisible opponent anymore, he was being hunted. Shadows pooled at the edges of the room, writhing like living things, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of crimson eyes gleaming in the darkness. The enemy wasn't just a phantom, it was learning, adapting, and now, it was making its move. A sudden crash echoed from downstairs. Jinwoo's head snapped toward the sound, his instincts screaming danger. The chessboard clattered to the floor as he bolted for the door, his dagger already materializing in his hand. The mansion's halls, once silent, now pulsed with an unnatural energy. Paintings on the walls twisted, their subjects' faces contorting into silent screams. He barely had time to process it before a shadowy tendril lashed out from the floor, aiming for his ankle. Jinwoo pivoted, slashing through it with practiced precision, but the severed end writhed and reformed instantly. "Persistent bastard," he muttered, backing into a defensive stance. The shadows weren't just attacking, they were hurting him. Toward what, he didn't know, but the game had clearly escalated. Then came the laughter. Soft, mocking, echoing from every direction. "You're losing, player," the voice taunted. But the real question is, do you even know what's at stake? Before Jinwoo could retort, the floor beneath him gave way. He barely managed to roll into the fall, landing hard in the mansion's basement. Dust choked the air, and the scent of rusted metal filled his nostrils. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying gently as if recently disturbed. And in the center of the room stood a figure, humanoid, but wrong, its body composed of shifting darkness, its face a void save for those same crimson eyes. Jinwoo didn't wait for it to speak. He lunged, dagger flashing, but the creature dissolved into smoke, reforming behind him. A fist of shadow slammed into his ribs, sending him skidding across the stone floor. Gritting his teeth, Jinwoo activated his Quicksilver ability, time slowing around him as he analyzed the creature's movements. It was fast, but not invincible. Every attack left a faint trail, a split-second delay before it fully materialized. He feinted left, then twisted mid-air, driving his dagger into the creature's shoulder. Black ichor sprayed, and the thing howled, its form flickering. Jinwoo pressed the advantage, summoning his shadow soldiers from the fallen darkness around them. Two spectral warriors emerged, their blades cutting through the creature's limbs. For a moment, victory seemed close, until the shadows on the walls detached, slithering into the creature's wounds, healing it instantly. "Clever," the creature hissed. "But you're not the only one who can adapt." The basement walls trembled, and the chains shot forward, wrapping around Jinwoo's wrists. He strained against them, but the metal burned with an unnatural cold. The creature loomed over him, its void-like face inches from his own. "You've been so focused on me. You didn't even notice the other player." A new presence entered the room, light footsteps, the scent of jasmine. Jinwoo's blood ran cold. "Hana?" His sister stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. But something was off. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her usual warmth replaced by a hollow stare. "Jinwoo," she whispered, her voice not quite her own. "You should have stayed out of the game." The creature chuckled. "Checkmate." Jinwoo's mind raced. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a battle for his sister's soul. And if he lost, the invisible enemy wouldn't just claim the board. It would claim everything. With a roar, Jinwoo summoned every ounce of his strength, shattering the chains. The fight was far from over, but now, the stakes were higher than ever. The chessboard shimmered under the dim glow of Jinwoo's lantern, its pieces locked in a battle only he could see. The invisible enemy's moves were calculated, relentless, but Jinwoo's fingers hovered over a knight, ready to strike, until the warehouse door exploded inward. Splinters rained down as a figure stepped through the smoke, their silhouette sharp against the moonlight. "You're wasting time playing games, Hunter," a woman's voice cut through the silence, laced with amusement. She tossed a dagger into the air, catching it by the blade, her crimson eyes glinting. "The real fight's outside." Jinwoo didn't flinch. His shadow soldiers materialized in an instant, blades drawn, but the woman moved faster. She blurred past them, a whirlwind of silver and leather, her dagger carving a shallow line across Jinwoo's forearm before he could react. Blood welled, but he smirked. "You're quick." She flipped the dagger again, grinning. "And you're slow. Name's Kayla. Heard you've been hunting my bounty." Kayla wasn't just another hunter, she was a wild card, a rogue operative who'd been tailing the same invisible forces Jinwoo had been battling. But where he sought answers, she wanted revenge. Her brother had vanished months ago, his last message scrawled in blood, "They're using the shadows." Now, she'd tracked the trail to Jinwoo, convinced he held the key. The tension shattered as the warehouse walls trembled. A monstrous hand, translucent as mist, tore through the ceiling, swiping at them both. Jinwoo rolled aside, summoning iron to block the strike, but Kayla lunged toward the creature. Her dagger glowed violet, slicing through the spectral flesh like it was paper. The beast roared, recoiling, but she was already airborne, driving her knee into its jaw. "Stop gawking and help me," she snapped. Jinwoo's shadow surged forward, their swords biting deep, but the creature dissolved into smoke, reforming behind Kayla. Its claws raked toward her spine, until Jinwoo teleported in, his fist encased in dark energy, punching clean through its chest. The beast screeched, disintegrating, but Kayla didn't thank him. Instead, she kicked his legs out from under him, pinning him with her dagger at his throat. "Who the hell are you?" she hissed. That thing wasn't just a monster. It was mimicking someone's moves. Jinwoo's eyes narrowed. He'd noticed it too, the creature's fighting style was eerily familiar. Before he could respond, the ground erupted. More spectral enemies rose, their forms shifting, each one mirroring the combat styles of hunters Jinwoo had faced before. One moved like Beru, another like Igris. Kayla cursed, leaping back as a replica of her own fighting style lunged at her, its dagger strikes perfectly mirrored. The battle became chaos. Jinwoo's shadows clashed with their doppelgangers, steel ringing against steel, while Kayla danced between her own reflections, her frustration mounting. "They're learning from us," she shouted, barely dodging a slash that nicked her shoulder. Jinwoo gritted his teeth. If these things adapted, they'd need to switch tactics, fast. He whistled, and his shadows abruptly changed formation, funneling the mimics into a tight circle. Kayla didn't wait for an explanation, she hurled a trio of explosive charms into the center. The blast sent the creatures reeling, their forms flickering, and Jinwoo seized the opening. He plunged his hand into the ground, summoning a wave of black spikes that impaled the mimics mid-recovery. They writhed, dissolving into ash. Silence fell, broken only by Kayla's ragged breaths. She wiped blood from her lip, eyeing Jinwoo with grudging respect. "Not bad. But we're not done." She jerked her chin toward the shattered remains of the chessboard. The pieces had rearranged themselves mid-battle, forming a new message: "The king waits." Jinwoo's stomach dropped. This wasn't just an attack, it was an invitation. And Kayla, with her vendetta and her uncanny speed, was either the best ally he could ask for or the worst possible liability. She sheathed her dagger, smirking. "So, you gonna tell me what we're really up against, or do I have to stab it out of you?" The game had just gotten a lot more complicated. Jinwoo's fingers hovered over the chessboard, the weight of his next move pressing down on him like a physical force. The pieces glowed faintly in the dim light of the abandoned cathedral, their positions a silent testament to the unseen enemy's cunning. He had played countless matches in his mind, anticipating every counter, yet the invisible opponent, shrouded in shadows and whispers, always seemed one step ahead. The air hummed with tension, thick enough to choke on, as he finally nudged his knight forward. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed through the hollow chamber, sending a chill down Jinwoo's spine. Predictable, the voice taunted, smooth and venomous. The Black Queen slid across the board of its own accord, taking his knight with a decisive click. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was a battle of wills, and he was losing. Then, the board shifted. The pieces dissolved into shadow, reforming into something far more sinister. The chessboard expanded, the squares stretching into a vast battlefield, and Jinwoo found himself standing amidst an army of spectral soldiers, his own summons, flickering like dying embers. Across from him, the enemy's forces materialized, their forms indistinct yet radiating overwhelming power. The rules had changed. This was no longer chess. This was war. A blade of darkness slashed toward him. Jinwoo barely sidestepped, his dagger flashing to parry the next strike. His heart pounded as he realized, his opponent wasn't just playing the game. It was the game. The invisible enemy wasn't some distant puppeteer, it was the battlefield itself, the shadows conspiring against him. Every move he made was anticipated, every strategy unraveled before it could take shape. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't win like this. Then, a voice, familiar, strained, cut through the chaos. Jinwoo. Run. His blood turned to ice. That voice, it was Igris. But how? The knight had fallen in battle weeks ago, his armor shattered, his loyalty unwavering to the end. Jinwoo spun, searching for the source, and there, flickering at the edge of the battlefield, stood Igris's spectral form, his crimson armor cracked and fading. A trap. A cruel, brilliant trap. The enemy hadn't just outmaneuvered him, it had exploited his deepest weakness. His loyalty to those who had fought beside him. Igris's ghostly hand reached out, fingers trembling, and Jinwoo's instinct screamed at him to retreat. But he couldn't. Not when one of his own was suffering. With a snarl, he lunged forward, daggers flashing, carving through the shadows that coiled around Igris. But the moment his blade made contact, the knight's form twisted, his armor blackening, his eyes hollowing into pits of endless night. The betrayal struck like a knife to the gut. Igris, no, the thing wearing his face lashed out, a blade of pure darkness impaling Jinwoo through the shoulder. Agony exploded through him. He staggered back, blood slicking his fingers as he clutched the wound. The enemy's laughter filled the air, triumphant, hungry. You never learn, it crooned. Sentiment is your downfall. Jinwoo's vision swam. He had been outplayed. Outmatched. The realization burned worse than the wound. But as the shadows closed in, something inside him shifted. A cold, calculating fury replaced the desperation. If the enemy wanted to exploit his emotions, fine. He'd turn that against it. With a roar, he ripped the shadow blade from his shoulder and hurled it back at the false Igris. The specter dissolved with a shriek, but Jinwoo didn't stop. He reached deep, past the pain, past the doubt, and pulled not on his own power, but on the enemy's. The shadows recoiled as if scalded. For the first time, the voice hesitated. What? Jinwoo grinned, blood staining his teeth. You're not the only one who can cheat. The battlefield trembled. The rules were his now. And he had just changed the game. The air inside the abandoned subway station was thick with a scent of damp concrete and rusted metal, the distant drip of water echoing like a countdown. Jinwoo stood at the center of the platform, his breath steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. The enemy was here, somewhere, its presence an oppressive shadow that slithered just beyond perception. His fingers twitched, the memory of his last defeat still fresh. The invisible enemy had moved like a phantom, striking without warning, its attacks precise and brutal. But this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. This time, he had trained for it. Across from him, Igris materialized, his crimson armor gleaming faintly in the dim light. The shadow soldier had been his most relentless sparring partner, pushing him to adapt, to think beyond mere strength. Jinwoo nodded, and Igris lunged, sword flashing. Jinwoo sidestepped, but the blade nicked his sleeve, a fraction slower, and it would have drawn blood. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. Speed wasn't enough. He needed to anticipate, to see the unseen. Closing his eyes, he reached into the shadows, feeling the subtle shift in the air, the faintest disturbance of dust. There, a ripple, almost imperceptible. He twisted, swinging his dagger in a wide arc. Metal met nothingness, but the resistance was real. A guttural snarl echoed through the station as the invisible enemy recoiled. Jinwoo grinned. He'd found the first clue, the creature's presence disrupted the environment. Now, he just had to exploit it. Above, the ceiling groaned, chunks of concrete breaking loose. The enemy wasn't just invisible, it was reshaping the battlefield. Jinwoo rolled as a slab crashed where he'd stood, dust billowing around him. He couldn't afford hesitation. Igris moved in unison with him, their synchronization honed through countless drills. As the enemy struck again, Jinwoo feinted left while Igris swung high, forcing the creature to reveal itself for a split second, long enough. Jinwoo's dagger found purchase, slicing through something solid yet incorporeal. Black ichor splattered the ground, sizzling like acid. The station trembled, the walls cracking as if the very structure rebelled against the unseen force. Time was running out. Jinwoo's mind raced. The enemy had a weakness, its reliance on the environment. If he could destabilize the battlefield further, he could corner it. With a sharp command, he summoned more shadows, his soldiers emerging in a wave. They didn't attack blindly, instead, they dismantled the station piece by piece, tearing at the supports, collapsing tunnels. The enemy's movements grew erratic, its invisibility flickering under the chaos. Then, the ceiling gave way. Jinwoo barely had time to react as the world came crashing down. He threw himself behind a pillar, debris raining around him. When the dust settled, the enemy stood fully visible for the first time, a monstrous figure of shifting darkness, its form barely holding together. Now was his chance. He charged, Igris at his flank, shadows swirling around them like a living storm. The enemy lashed out, but Jinwoo ducked under its claws, driving his dagger deep into its core. It screamed, the sound reverberating through the ruins. But it wasn't enough. With a snarl, the creature retaliated, its body surging forward like a tidal wave of darkness. Jinwoo barely raised his arms in time, the impact sending him skidding back. Blood trickled from his lip. He was running out of stamina. Then, a voice cut through the chaos, a familiar one. "Need a hand?" Jinwoo turned to see Cha-Haen standing at the edge of the rubble, her sword gleaming. Behind her, a group of hunters fanned out, weapons drawn. He hadn't expected backup, but he wasn't about to refuse it. "Took you long enough," he muttered. She smirked. "You're welcome." Together, they advanced. The hunters harried the creature from all sides, their attacks forcing it to divide its attention. Jinwoo seized the opening, channeling every ounce of his power into one final strike. His dagger flared with black energy as he plunged it into the enemy's heart. The creature convulsed, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, the ground shook again, but this time, not from the enemy. A distant roar echoed through the tunnels, deeper, more primal. Jinwoo's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Cha-Haen met his gaze, her expression grim. "You've got to be kidding me." He wiped the blood from his mouth. "We're just getting started." The real fight was coming. And they had to be ready. The air crackled with tension as Jinwoo stood alone in the darkened arena, his breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. Shadows coiled around him like living tendrils, responding to his will, but his opponent remained unseen, a specter of malice that defied detection. The invisible enemy had toyed with him, striking from the void, but Jinwoo's instincts had sharpened with every near-fatal blow. This time, he wouldn't just react, he would dominate. A whisper of movement to his left, Jinwoo twisted, his dagger flashing as it clashed against an unseen blade. Sparks erupted in the dark, illuminating the faintest outline of his adversary for a split second before it vanished again. "You're getting predictable," Jinwoo muttered, rolling his shoulder to shake off the numbness from the last impact. His muscles burned, but pain was an old friend. He needed to push further. The enemy struck again, this time from above, a crushing downward slash aimed at his skull. Jinwoo barely raised his arm in time, his bracer absorbing the brunt of the force, but the impact drove him to one knee. The ground beneath him cracked. Gritting his teeth, he channeled his mana, feeling it surge through his limbs like wildfire. Enough hiding. His voice was a low growl as shadows erupted from his body, lashing out in a wide arc. The unseen foe hissed as the darkness grazed its form, revealing a flicker of distorted armor before it melted back into nothingness. Jinwoo didn't wait. He lunged forward, his dagger transforming mid-strike into a massive Svihendar wreathed in black flame. The blade carved through the air with a deafening roar, forcing the enemy to materialize just long enough to parry. Their weapons locked, trembling from the sheer force of the clash. Up close, Jinwoo finally saw it, a knight clad in shifting void steel, its hollow eyes burning with cold fury. "There you are," Jinwoo snarled, pressing forward. The knight retaliated with a brutal kick to his ribs, sending him skidding back. Blood filled Jinwoo's mouth, but he grinned. Every exchange taught him more, its speed, its patterns. He just needed to push past his limits. The battlefield became a blur of motion. Jinwoo weaved between strikes, countering with precision, but the knight adapted just as quickly. A feint left, then a sudden thrust, Jinwoo barely sidestepped, feeling the blade graze his side. He retaliated with a spinning slash, but the knight dissolved into mist, reappearing behind him. A searing pain exploded across his back as the enemy's sword bit deep. Staggering, Jinwoo dropped to a knee. His vision swam, but his mind raced. He couldn't outpace it. Couldn't overpower it. But maybe. The knight advanced, its sword raised for the killing blow. At the last second, Jinwoo's shadow stretched unnaturally, elongating, twisting, before solidifying into a perfect duplicate of himself. The knight's blade passed harmlessly through the decoy as the real Jinwoo erupted from beneath, his Zweihandar igniting with raw energy. Checkmate. The sword cleaved through the knight's chest, void steel shattering like glass. A deafening screech filled the air as the creature writhed, its form flickering between existence and oblivion. Jinwoo didn't let up. He poured every ounce of his remaining strength into the strike, the black flames consuming the knight entirely. For a moment, there was silence. Then, light. The arena dissolved around him, the illusion breaking as Jinwoo collapsed onto solid ground, gasping. His body screamed in protest, but victory thundered in his veins. He'd done it. He'd pushed beyond his limits, adapted, and conquered. But as the dust settled, a new presence made itself known, a towering figure emerging from the remnants of the battlefield, its aura suffocating. Jinwoo's grip tightened on his sword. The real battle was only beginning. The air crackled with tension as Jinwoo stood alone in the void, his breath ragged, muscles screaming from exhaustion. The invisible enemy had been relentless, its movements unpredictable, its strikes precise and deadly. Every move Jinwoo made was countered before he could even complete it, as if the adversary could read his thoughts. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mixing with sweat as he tightened his grip on his dagger. "Come on," he muttered, forcing his trembling legs to steady. "Just one more time." The enemy struck again, a blur of motion, unseen but felt in the oppressive weight of its presence. Jinwoo barely twisted away in time, the force of the attack grazing his ribs, sending a sharp pain radiating through his side. He gritted his teeth and lashed out with his dagger, but it met only empty air. A mocking laugh echoed in the darkness, taunting him. "You can't win," the voice whispered, cold and disembodied. "You're just a pawn in a game you don't understand." Jinwoo's vision blurred for a moment, his body pushed beyond its limits. But then, something inside him snapped, not weakness, but defiance. He remembered every battle he had fought, every life he had touched, every moment of despair he had turned into strength. His shadow soldiers, though absent now, had left their mark on his soul. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. With a roar, Jinwoo channeled every ounce of his remaining energy, his body igniting with a surge of power. Shadows coiled around him like living tendrils, responding to his will. For the first time, the enemy hesitated. Jinwoo didn't waste the opening. He lunged, not with his dagger, but with his mind, reaching into the void and seizing the invisible presence with his shadows. The enemy writhed, its form flickering into visibility, a spectral figure with hollow eyes, its once smug expression now twisted in shock. "Checkmate," Jinwoo growled, driving his dagger straight into the enemy's core. The creature let out a piercing shriek as the blade erupted with dark energy, tearing through its form like a storm. The void trembled, cracks of light splitting the darkness as the enemy disintegrated into nothingness. Silence. Then, the world shifted. The void collapsed around him, reality stitching itself back together. Jinwoo staggered as solid ground formed beneath his feet, the weight of his victory crashing over him. He dropped to one knee, gasping for air, his body battered but alive. The chessboard, metaphorical or real, he still wasn't sure, had been cleared. The game was over. But the aftermath was just beginning. As the dust settled, Jinwoo sensed a change in the air, a shift in the balance of power. The invisible enemy had been a harbinger, a test. Defeating it hadn't just saved him, it had altered something fundamental in the universe. The shadows whispered of new possibilities, of doors now open that had been sealed for eons. A familiar presence approached, Baru, emerging from the remnants of the void, his form flickering but intact. "My king," he rasped, bowing his head. "You've done it." Jinwoo managed a tired smile. "We did it," he corrected. Around them, the other shadow soldiers began to materialize, their loyalty unwavering even in the face of oblivion. But victory came with questions. What had the enemy truly been? A guardian? A gatekeeper? Jinwoo's fingers curled into fists as he realized this battle had been just one piece of a larger puzzle. The universe was vast, and his role in it was far from over. As he rose to his feet, the ground beneath him hummed with energy, as if acknowledging his triumph. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Jinwoo had crossed a threshold. The next game, whenever it came, would be on his terms. And this time, he wouldn't be playing alone.